Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody to Abbeycwmhir. And we will do a little tour around, a little peregrination around the village, looking at various buildings, considering their history, how they came to be here, what purpose they fulfilled, and where we are with them today. And obviously this is the centre of the village. Abbeycwmhir has a long history with the Abbey, which we shall look at later, going back to medieval times, and also a lot more modern history and big estates, and now much smaller estates or no estates at all, as they have disappeared over the years. And inevitably the families that ran the estates are the people who have left a mark on the landscape. We always try to look at landscape history as someone was there before you. All right, there was always somebody a little bit further back and a bit further back and a bit further back, and that's how we build history. And very often it's good to learn history not from dates way back up to the present day, but look at the present day and work backwards, because that's sometimes much more illuminating. Anyway, this is the centre of the village. You're standing on what appears to be a car park at the moment, known locally as the Square. It's fairly typical of the Abbey, it's anything but a square. And it used to have a totally different purpose to what its function is today. We look at this building here, which actually used to be the school. It's known, its proper name is Cross Cottage, but if you look at it, you could see perhaps some ideas of the architecture, the big windows, the high windows on the ground floor, which are very typical of a Victorian school. So this was the first school that was built in the village, and standards of literacy were not terribly good in the 1850s when that was built, and the earlier times. It's interesting to look at the parish registers, which we have some copies in the church, and discover the number of people who have signed the register for their marriage with a cross, and somebody else has written by Mary Jones her mark. People were really fairly illiterate because there was no national education system. So this building was originally erected by Francis Aspinall Phillips, who was the first of the Phillips family to own the estate. Most people, when they think of Abbeycwmhir and their estates, think of the Phillips, but they were the most recent long-term landowners in this area. And if you look up on the gable there, you can see a little bearing, and it says F.A.P., Francis Aspinall Phillips, and the date under this is 1858. And that was the building of that particular school, first school in the area. 1857 even, right. I think my crib notes, which Aggie's got, to say something like that. Anyway, there we were. And there's a little bit of hidden history with the Phillips family. They were mill owners in Stockport, Greater Manchester as it is now, and they had considerable money that they had made out of the business of producing cotton goods of one sort or another, and they were also specialists in producing ribbon. But it created a lot of wealth for the family. And if you were an industrialist in the 19th century, a mark of your success was to have a big country estate. And it just so happened that in the 1830s, land was for sale here because the previous owner of estate lands here had gone bankrupt. We'll talk about more that later on. So we have the Phillips family arriving on the scene in 1837. But the hidden history lies partly with the father of Francis Aspinall Phillips, Francis Phillips, of a previous generation, who was very well connected, again a mill owner, and he witnessed two interesting events in the around 1810, 1820. In 1812, Francis Phillips happened to be in the House of Commons in London, not the House of Commons, not the House of Parliament that we have today. That was a little bit later, I think. And he was present when an attack took place on the then British Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval. And Perceval was the only, fortunately, the only British Prime Minister to have been assassinated. And Francis Phillips was present when that attack took place. He intervened with others. They apprehended the assailant and also made attempts to apply first aid and save Spencer Perceval's life. Unfortunately, for Perceval anyway, they failed in that. One might feel like assassinating British Prime Ministers from time to time, but that was the only... I didn't say that. But there we were. Okay, so that was one thing that he was involved with. It's living history. One of the things that we've been doing recently with the Abbeycwmhir Trust is looking at what we call 15-minute history, which is the hidden histories that you don't see in the guidebooks, that you don't see when you're walking around the village. And another thing that Phillips was witnessed was in 1819, when the riots took place in Manchester. He was present at the riots that were recently portrayed in a very good film a few years ago. And he was witnessing that with his wife's cousin, who was the owner of Style Mill, which you may have visited. It's a National Trust visit, just Quarry Bank, just outside of Stockport there. So although Abbeycwmhir is a remote area, you think it's cut off from the rest of the world, down the years, down the centuries, there have been events taking place which have affected people who lived here and who had connections with there as well. So that was Francis Phillips. The building itself, say, was the school for a little while, not for very long. It lasted as the school until 1868, when the Phillips family, of course, who owned absolutely everything, moved the school 300 yards down the road that way, because the squire's wife, Anna Theophila her name was, found the children playing on the yard here next to the hall very noisy and very tiresome. So they simply moved the school down the road, out of earshot. Well, I'm sure you could still hear the children. There was never very many children at the school when it closed in 1970, early 70s. There was only 30 children there. So step inside. So they had a redundant building, and what were they going to do with it? Well, fortunately they didn't demolish it, because it's a rather nice building, very classic of its sort. So at the bad 1860s as well, they were expanding the hall, they were making that much bigger. If you've been inside the hall when it was open, you will know it has a large number of rooms. At 52 rooms, one for every week of the year, rather nice. And they didn't have a laundry. So they'd converted the school into the laundry, and that's what its function was for decades following from that, right up into the 20th century. And this place, although it's called Cross Cottage, is always known in the village as the laundry. The name lives on. So there are various uses for it. We'll go into the church next, have a look at the yew trees on the way in. The one on our left is reckoned to have had an age of at least 500 years, and the one on the right, several people have assessed it, and I'm not quite sure how you assess the age of a yew tree, apart from doing dendrochronology, which is the sort of thing we do with timbers in buildings to find out how old they are. 1,000 years possibly on that one. And I believe you can often tell how that a tree is very ancient, a yew tree is very ancient, because it starts to hollow out inside as the annual rings expand and the tree gets bigger, they tend to separate inside. And the very famous one in Scotland, which is completely hollow, but stays in place. And the yew tree could be very significant when it comes to the location of the abbey, which we'll see a little bit later. Anyway, we've got a nice little painting that was done back in the 1850s of a different church to this one. The entrance was round the other side of the railing there, across the little bridge there, and then the path that runs diagonally across the churchyard, because of course this was the school playground. Anyway, this is the Lich Gate, which was built around 1900, and it was built as a memorial to Mary Beatrice Phillips, who died in 1898. And it was built as a token of appreciation, we are told, by the workers on the estate. And it would have been built by the estate craftsmen as well. It's a little bit of repair work in recent years, but it's basically original and stood there for a long time. Very much a feature of country churches, and it served a specific purpose. The main object of the exercise with the Lich Gate was not actually to prettify the churchyard. What you did is assembled the bearers and the hearse before a funeral, and when it was time to go into the service and conduct the funeral arrangements, they moved off from the Lich Gate. But they had a purely practical purpose originally.